Hello, second time trying to use the YouTube live stream here to do a chapter. Still haven't processed the other one because, and this took me a while to figure out, once you do a YouTube live stream, you can watch it, but you can't download it until some invisible process of the video processing has happened. The sort of morning pages that I did today and that chapter are not available for download, but every prior live stream that I've done starting yesterday is available for download. So it should work eventually. I'm just going to trust it. Although I also realized that it was a 36-minute read, the first chapter, and this chapter 12 is also going to be fairly long. And the result is going to be that I'm going to have to chop it up in iMovie in order to get it down to 15-minute segments that I can put into Runway. I'm not going to lose any segments, but I'm going to be able to do longer segments, and it's not necessarily saving me a ton of work, I suppose. And I'm still going to have to figure out how to find breaks that don't clang when I don't intentionally do them in the middle of a chapter. Maybe I can, if I notice that I'm at 14 and a half minutes in this stream, I can give a special pause that I can later take advantage of in iMovie. Also, there's a spider crawling around on my chair somewhere on my computer. And I'm not scared of it, but I don't want to crush it. And it's not going to be visible to you, but I may pause and say hello to it at some point. Okay. Chapter 12, The Shape of the Law. Throughout June of 1948, while we were still at Windy Cabin, Andy so conscientiously pursued caribou in the name of science that I was forced to remember I, too, was a biologist of sorts. I salved my conscience by amassing a collection of the small mammals that live in the mosses and lichens of the plains. My collecting equipment consisted of 3 dozen ordinary mousetraps, widely dispersed, and marked with little flags of red cloth so they could be found again. One day I casually asked Utek to check some of the traps while I looked at the rest. An hour later, when I had finished my part and was heading back for the cabin, he rejoined me. He carried his skin pack sack, and as he jog-trotted across the tundra, he held the bag well away from his side as if it contained something far too precious to be subjected to bumps and jiggles. Curious, I asked what he had found, but for once he was taciturn, refusing to answer except with muffled grunts. He seemed preoccupied, so I did not press the question. At the cabin, I unpacked half a dozen mice and lemmings for my specimen bag and laid them out on the table while Utek watched me with a puzzled frown on his face. At last I inquired whether anything had been caught in his share of the traps. He came to life suddenly, pulled open his sack, and after delving into its murky depths for a moment or two, produced a little bundle carefully wrapped in moss. This he handed to me without comment. I'm laughing because I know what's going to happen, even though it's been years since I read it. He handed it to me without comment and watched intently as I unrolled it. The bundle contained a single mousetrap lying on a large piece of chocolate-colored peat, which bore the clear and unmistakable imprint of a wolf's foot. Somewhat taken aback, I turned to Utek and asked him what this odd combination was supposed to mean. But Utek became dreadfully embarrassed and refused to open his mouth. When I tried being stern, he began to stutter, and at last he turned and fled to his tent. Later on, Ahoto, always the most direct and unabashed of the Helmut men, paid me a call. I showed him Utek's strange trophy and asked him to explain its significance. He too seemed to have some difficulty in finding his tongue, but at last he told me what I wanted to know. It was a shining example of the oblique mind of the Eskimo, if you want to put it that way. But to me, it was a prime example of the tremendous delicacy the Inuit can show when they feel called upon to give advice to a white man who, poor fellow, has more wealth than sense. Utek had looked at my mousetraps, and it had been painfully obvious to him that I was not going to catch any foxes or wolves. Not even in his most lurid dreams had he thought that white men could put value on lemmings and mice, or that I would deliberately try to catch these little beasts. So it seemed to Utek that I was just incredibly naive in the arts of the trapper. Being my song cousin, he felt it was his duty to show me the futility of my trapping methods, but in such a manner that I would feel neither resentful nor foolish. Utek hoped that when I saw the big wolf's track beside the frail little trap, I would get the point without any words being spoken. When Ahoto explained all this, I was annoyed, for I felt I was being treated as a somewhat backward child. Not that he hasn't had examples, Mawad, of wanting to see them as backwards children as well, and he's openly wrestled with that in the book. Calling Utek to the cabin, I went to great lengths to explain why I wanted mice, not wolves, and Utek, sensing my indignation, listened with grave concentration as I tried to explain about museums and science and other inexplicable phenomena of the white man's way of life. When I finished, Utek picked up a bundle of my traps and walked off with them into the barrens. The next morning, there were 5 mice laid out on my skinning table, but Utek never again spoke of my mouse trapping, nor did he show any further interest in improving my trapping technique. In interfering, no matter how hesitantly, with what I was doing, he had contravened a basic code of his people, and it may be he was ashamed of what he had done. Yeah. I can think of a lot of examples in my life of convincing yourself that you need to interfere in somebody else's life because you think you understand it and you know what's best, and that they are really more like you than they actually are, that your business is their business. I've had some of that struggle with my uncle. Sometimes lectures, talks of an hour or two, we sit there and he just talk and talk and talk, just trying to convey his point of view and his lessons in life, and basically just trying to get me to feel like he knows the way that I should be doing things. And it's difficult because it just doesn't work that way, having it sort of pushed on you. He's talked about seeing that with his daughter and just finally realizing that she just wants to be accepted as she is, which is kind of like the way it is for me. I'm almost constitutionally incapable of trying to force other people to be like me. It can make me a little bit too much of a pushover and not standing up for myself in the ways that I maybe should sometimes, but it does help people to be more open and relaxed in themselves around me, which some people have commented is a very peaceful thing for them. This is the first great law of the land, that a man's business is sacred unto himself, and that it is no part of his neighbor's duty to interfere in any way unless the community is endangered. However, this does not mean that assistance is withheld in cases of need. In fact, the second and perhaps most important law of the land is that while there is food, equipment, or bodily strength in any one of the tents, no man in another tent shall want for any of these. This belief has led to a communization of all material things in the most real and best sense of the word. Nevertheless, individual ownership still exists in the camps, and this paradox may seem hard to grasp. Put it this way: every item of equipment is the personal property of one person or of a family group. But if a stranger is in need of a spear, should he come to the place, any spear is his for the taking. He does not necessarily need to ask permission of the owner, though he usually does, and no direct recompense is expected or offered. He may or may not return the spear when he is finished, for the spear is now his property, and is not just something he borrowed. Very interesting conversations to be had here about the complicated dynamics in civilized, overpopulated worlds of socialism and communism, and the way it's idealized or demonized by liberals or conservatives. I'd very much like to see how this chapter would be read by Ted Cruz. I would have said Donald Trump, but he doesn't read. Maybe he'd listen to my audiobook. If you know him, tell him to give it a listen. Obviously, the system is not abused. Used with discretion and only under pressure of real need, it has greatly assisted in making men's existence possible in the barrens. The man who requires a spear will always, if he has time and materials, make one for himself. However, the man who needs a spear urgently takes one from a neighbor, and it is given to him with good will. This unusual approach to the problem of ownership was a source of annoyance to me until I grasped its significance. When I first came among the Hamut, they, with their limited knowledge of white men, treated me as they would treat one another. They were not aware of the gap in law and usage which separated us, which is very common. Tremendously hard to understand that your own culture is not the only culture and that your way of seeing things is not the only way of seeing things. And the more different a culture from your own, the more difficulties and tragedies can arise from trying to bridge that gap. I think I've read this sentence, but I'm going to read it again anyway. They were not aware of the gap in law and usage which separated us. For instance, I had a rifle, a souvenir picked up during the war, which I treasured. It was an excellent deer gun, and it went with me wherever I went, and at night it stood close beside me. I seldom used it, for I did not shoot for amusement or sport, and the occasions when Andy and I needed meat were few, since the Eskimos kept us well supplied. One day, a party of 5 of Helmut men walked down from the Little Hills country to visit us at the camp by Windy River. The weather had been exceptionally bad, and the trip took nearly 3 days. These men had not brought rifles, for they had no ammunition. During the 3 days of the march, they had existed on 2 little suckers they caught with their hands in a stream. After some 60 miles of the most devilish walking in all the world, they arrived at our camp, thoroughly tired and hungry, and they did not ask us for food. To ask outright would have been a breach of good manners. One does not ask for food in the barrens, it is automatically offered to a visitor on his arrival. But I was busy with some trivial chore. I greeted the visitors abstractly and went back to my job, while the 5 hungry men sat and waited with the most perfect patience. Probably feeling a little bit sad and confused about this poor white man who did not understand the proper way of behaving. Then Alec saw a deer on the slope across the river from camp, and he at once seized my rifle from its place by the side of the cabin and ran off to intercept the animal. He was gone well over an hour, and long before he returned, I had missed the rifle. Without thinking, I flew into a rage and stormed over to the waiting Helmut, demanding the instant return of my gun. It must have seemed like an incredible display of bad manners and infantile rage to those men, but they humored me. Utek smiled reassuringly and explained that Alec had only borrowed the rifle to kill a deer with because they were all very hungry. Then, believing he had adequately explained things, he began to chat cheerfully about the bad weather. I was not in a mood for amiable chatter. I was bad weather myself, for I was thrice damned if any Eskimo who felt a casual urge was going to trot off with my treasured rifle under his arm. Aluktuk came back at last, using the rifle as a shoulder stick on which to sling most of the edible portion of the deer he had shot. The barrel was drenched in blood, and the stock was scratched where it had banged against rocks. Aluktuk flung his load to the ground and came into the cabin, carrying the tongue and the brisket, the choice parts of the deer. He leaned the rifle against the door, handed me the meat, and smiled pleasantly. And then I blasted him. That was a pause because I'm almost at 15 minutes. Poor Aluktuk. During all the rest of the time I knew him, he was never again fully at ease in my presence. After that day, he approached me as if I were a potentially dangerous animal to be humored and placated constantly. Later on, I did my best to remove the bad impression I had made, but I never succeeded completely. Now, when I remember how the Helm would feel about these little things, I can understand why I failed. The Helmut forgave me, or rather, they never judged me for my infantile outbursts of selfishness. But in the future, it was understood that I was an unfortunate barbarian who was as wildly jealous of his possessions as a wolf bitch is of her cubs. There was no retaliation, and I was at liberty to borrow and keep any possession of the people that I might fancy I needed. If I didn't care to play the game as it was played in the barrens, that was my privilege, and I was not to be penalized for it. The two unwritten laws I have mentioned are loosely combined with all other laws of the land in a code of behavior known as the law of life. At which point I've got to pause because Daniel Quinn maybe borrowed it directly from this book. He talks directly about the law of life in Ishmael and how important it is to fostering genuine evolution and preventing life from a species turning cancerous as human civilization has made human beings to seem to turn, when in fact it's only the culture of human civilization that has made us be a cancer on the world. Human beings themselves are still just as perfectly evolved to the world as they've always been, if they're living in the way that they're evolved to live. So indirectly, I suppose, once again, I'm advocating that you read Daniel Quinn's book, Ishmael. All of these delicately balanced minor and major restrictions which go to make up the law are flexible, and yet they impose barriers upon which an Ilhamo does not dream of stepping. Very probably it is in the flexible nature of the laws, their openness to individual interpretation, and their capacity to adjust to individual cases that accounts for the remarkable absence of what we know as crime in the camps of the Ilhamo. Of all the stories written about the Inuit, as a whole, the majority have dwelt with a morbid and smug satisfaction on the Eskimo deviations from the moral codes we white men have developed. Tales of cannibalism, wife sharing, murder, infanticide, cruelty, and theft appear with monotonous frequency in Arctic stories, where they not only serve to supply a sensational element, but also provide the popular justification for the intrusion of the self-righteous white men who would destroy the laws and beliefs of the people in order to replace them with others which have no place in the land. Take murder as an example. If you examine the Royal Canadian Mounted Police reports for the last 20 years and compare the number of murders committed by Eskimos with the number of murders recorded in a corresponding numerical segment of any province of Canada or any state of the Union, you will discover that murder is a rarity in the Inuit camps, a phenomena. Furthermore, many of the so-called Eskimo murders were not murders at all, but mercy killings dictated by dire necessity. Of the homicides which remain, the balance are concerned with the killing of white men when the murderers were under implied or direct threat from the visitors, threats which brought an unreasoning fear to the Inuit, for they were threats which could not be understood by the Eskimo mind. We do not know of an authentic case of an Eskimo killing a white man for motives of revenge or gain, but only from motives of self-defense, mistaken or real. The basic motivation of such killings has always been fear. There are other causes for the rare murders which are committed, and of these blood revenge must be mentioned, though there are only very few authentic cases of it in all the annals of the North. There is, too, the case of the amok killer in the grip of a strange malady called Arctic hysteria. This form of temporary insanity is, of course, not restricted to the Eskimos. In the past few years, there have been numerous amok killings in the United States and Canada. In many cases, these resulted from a religious mania. However, such derangements among Eskimos are seldom traceable to the native religious beliefs of the Inuit. The most notorious case of a mass killing among the Eskimos follows hard on the visit of a missionary to a native village. When the RCMP investigated rumors of murder in this village, they found that one man who had been impressed and frightened by dimly conceived and misunderstood aspects of Christian dogma had become extremely morose and had finally gone mad. He believed that he was the reincarnation of Christ, and when he announced this fact, a wave of hysteria swept his village. The madman murdered several people before he was finally executed by an old Inuk who, almost alone, had remained aloof from the white man's religion, and so, in this case, had alone managed to remain sane enough to deal with the murderer. The point I wish to make is that murder for motives of gain, or for other cold-blooded reasons of self, is foreign to the mind of the Hamoit. With them, the killing of a man may be sanctioned only as a solution to a situation where other men's lives are threatened. In all the folk history of the hamlet, there exists only a handful of memories of homicide, and most of these were brought about as the sole possible means of removing internal dangers which threatened the people. There is, for example, the case of one man who became mad during the long Arctic night and killed two of his brothers, who he believed were plotting against his life, then threatened all those in the camp. He was a victim of Arctic hysteria, and he was himself killed only after a consultation of all the remaining men had resulted in the decision to destroy him for the good of the camp and the group. Infanticide is another favorite bogey of the missionaries and a standby of sensationalist writers. The tragedy is that it is most certainly does occur and will continue to occur while there is need of it. That is the point. There is an inescapable need for it at times, and nothing we can say will change the need. Nothing we can preach to the Inuit will alleviate that tragic necessity. The need for infanticide produces the most terrible situation an Eskimo can be forced to cope with, for all Eskimos, and the Inuit in particular, are passionately fond of their children. Their young ones receive more deep-rooted affection and are shown more tolerance and kindness than many of the children of our homes ever know. To have children and to raise them to maturity is a passion even stronger in the Hamlet than in us, because the people are much closer to the primeval drive towards reproduction of the species than we are. But despite the love they bear for their offspring, and despite their consuming desire to see children grow into men of their blood, there are times when a more desperate emotion overwhelms the parents. To understand what infanticide really means in the Barrens, you must first understand that in those hard lands, all human life is valued according to a fixed priority system that may seem callous to us who can afford to oppose sentimentality to reality. The unwritten order of survival places the man, the hunter, at the head of the list as the most indispensable member of the family group. He is the provider, and should he die, it does not greatly matter whether or not the rest of the family lives through the immediate crisis, since they cannot live for long afterwards without a hunter's help. Next to the man stands his wife. In there is, if there's more than one wife, the youngest stands next to the man. For her womb, the continuity of new life will be maintained. Yet even she is not irreplaceable, for there is a surplus of women in the land where many men lose their lives simply in the course of their everyday efforts. Old wives quickly lose their priority, for their wombs become sterile, and they can give little more to their race. The children must stand below both the man and his wife. This is a cruel thing indeed, but the cruelty is not the work of the parents. It weighs more heavily upon them than it does on the children. But new birth can replace sons and daughters, and so their loss is tragic only in terms of emotions. For while wombs remain fertile and loins remain potent, children may be born again. The old people stand at the lowest point of the scale. The men whose arms are no longer strong and the women whose wombs are no longer fecund. These live on the thin edge of time, with death always before them. When the choice of living and dying comes upon a camp of the people, when starvation announces the coming of death, then the aged ones must be prepared to go first, to seek death voluntarily, so that the rest of the family may cling a little longer to life. The old ones seldom die a natural death, and often they die by their own hands. Suicide is not lawful in our eyes, but as it comes to the people, it is a great and a very heroic sacrifice, for it is the old who must fear death most and who will find it the hardest to die. I think about the way old people are incredibly undervalued in our culture. They aren't teachers because there's so much change and their knowledge becomes out of date with technology, but also the sense that with retirement and demographics that uh, In some perspectives, they can be a burden on the youthful, active um, aspects of community and yeah, children and suffering and in their way because having to deal with parents and old folks' homes and old people never intentionally step aside, nor should they. But it's a different kind of system and sense of burden. A lot of conversation and thought to be had there. Put coldly like this, the value placed on the lives of men, women, and children seems like a harsh, unnatural thing, but there is nothing else to be done. Who can care for helpless old people when their sons and daughters are gone? Who but the wolves? Who can care for children who have not yet been weaned when their mother is gone? Only the wind and the snow. What can the wife feed her family when there is no man to bring in the meat of the deer? Only tears and the hard taste of dying. The logic and order of death in the barrens is more inexorable than death itself, and is inescapable. Yet there are few of the people who, when the time of decision is on them, do not try desperately to escape the horror of seeing a loved one go into the night of the winter. Love overcomes logic. Many families have perished because love was too strong to let logic save the lives of all but a few. How many stories we hear in our culture of young people, part maybe because of the money of inheritance, are anxious for the old people to die, for the sick to die. Certainly, that's the case in Ivan Ilyich, where he's very clear that his family, he's become a burden to them. Pausing again because I should be taking a break. 15 minutes are up. Yes, infanticide happens, and I have seen Utek with his fourth child, Kalek, and I knew his other three children did not live their first year to its end. I have seen the overmastering devotion Utek feels for Kalek, and I have seen the frantic desperation which fills him when danger threatens the child. But I should not like to know or feel what Utek felt as he first watched his first children die, unable to help them in the face of the grim trickery death played upon him. Let the moralists peddle their wares to those who would think of the Inuit as barbaric and bestial people who destroy their own children. Let them preach the white man's love, which must be brought into the dark, savage hearts of the Inuit. But let them keep their sanctimonious mouthings from the ears of Utek and those of his race, who alone know what it is to assist death in his work. And if death and suffering is really inevitable, and love and pain is really what the spirit most benefits from on and after death, if there's some kind of rebirth and reincarnation, then and time is really an illusion, and your rebirth could be into a life that by our sense of time is in the past. Maybe the lives of civilized people like us are reborn into the lives of so-called primitive people centuries or millennia in the past. That would be a that would be a real thing. There was a place in the Great Plains called the Lake of the Dead Child, and on a promontory of this lake stands a small cairn of stones. Through the interstices of the rocks, you can see the tiny bones of a child, and on the grave are the decayed remnants of many things: robes of the best deer hide, gifts of meat, toys carved from scraps of wood, and comic boots sewed for a child's foot with infinite care. They are all things needful for the living, or for the dead. The story of that grave concerns a family of 3 who lived alone by the lake during a winter long past. On a certain year, the father was stricken down with a strange illness so that he was unable to complete his fall hunt and did not make a large enough kill to last through the winter. It is told how the blizzards came early and hunger followed. It is told how the dogs were eaten and how, at last, the woman understood that only if she made her way for 10 days' travel on foot over the winter barrens to the camps of her kinsfolk could her family survive. The Hamo do not say what the woman's thoughts were as she saw the decision she must make. She knew she must go alone and could not carry a child with her. She knew, too, that she could not leave the child behind, for her husband was too ill to attend to it, and there was no food he could give it, for the child had not yet been weaned. Nothing is said about the thoughts of the woman, but it is told how she left that camp after coming to her decision. The few scraps of food which remained she placed by her husband on the sleeping ledge, and the child she placed under the snow. It took the woman nearly 2 weeks to reach the igloos of her people, and for 5 of those days she walked in a blizzard. She walked almost 100 miles without food, and knowing she'd left her child to die rather than let it starve to death. I have often heard that freezing to death is a surprisingly pleasant, ironically warm way to go. But she arrived safely at her kinsman's igloos. In a few days, the dog team of her brother took her back to the shores of the lake of the dead child. The sick man was rescued and lived. In the years that followed, this couple had many children, and some of these still live in the land. But each year, while they lived, the woman and her husband returned to the shores of the distant lake in the first days of spring and placed fresh clothing, food, and toys on the grave of their firstborn. Truly, infanticide does exist in the land of the people. There is also the crime of sexual promiscuity, which is almost as abhorrent to the men who carry the word, capital W word, into the far places, as is the crime of murder. Oh, Christianity and the demonization of sexuality. But I know from my experiences with the Eskimos that promiscuity in the world of the Inuit does not compare with its sordid prevalence in our lands. True, erotic play among children is common, but never hidden or driven out of sight to become something dirty or obscene. Apart from this, wife sharing, as it is called, is really the only manifestation of sexual promiscuity in the Barrens. Women for hire, clandestine sexual experiences, the thinly cloaked extramarital relations of those who have been joined by the church, all but these belong to our race and not to the Inuit. Wife trading in the Inuit way of life is a voluntary device which helps alleviate the hardships of the land. To begin with, only song cousins or other close friends would normally consider the exchange of their wives. Contrary to popular opinion about Eskimos, a stranger is not expected to leap into bed with his wife of his host. That is a stupid lie with no basis in fact. Well, perhaps it has a basis in fact, for many of the white men who have come to the land have demanded just such an arrangement, and because the Inuit will go to great lengths to meet the wishes of a guest, it has occurred. When a man must make a prolonged trip on a muskox hunt or on a visit to a distant relative, or for purposes of trading at some distant post, he often leaves his wife at home because of the dangers of travel. If there are children, it would be foolish to risk either the wife or the children when there is no need. So it happens that when a man arrives at his destination, his own cousin may, with the wife's full consent, volunteer to share his wife with the visitor during the time of his stay. This is contrary to the law of the white man, but to my unsubtle mind it seems a perfectly sane arrangement, particularly since there is no problem of illegitimate children in the Barrens, nor any jealousy of paternity. To the Yahamut, the children themselves are what matter, and a child from any source, whatever, is as welcome as any other child in the camps. Paternity is unimportant. A man who questioned the paternity of his child would be thought mad. It would be the opinion of those in the camps that he ought to be grateful for the presence of any child. A child sired by our visitor is just as much the son of the man of the family as the children he sires for himself. I don't remember exactly where I read it, but another book, I think from Daniel Quinn's recommended reading list, has to do with natives of, I think, New Zealand. And there's a line that I've often quoted about paternity where one of the natives is criticizing a white man who comes and questions the paternity of one of the tribesmen, and the tribesman looks at him like he's crazy and says, "You white men are insane. You value we value all children. You value only your own." Now, this may be uncivilized behavior, but is it as barbaric as our repudiation of bastard children who must bear the stigma of their parents' sin throughout their lives? It's not the child's fault. As for theft and dishonesty, before the coming of white men, the Helmet were unaware of the meanings of these words. Obviously, theft can hardly occur in a land where the rules of ownership are those I have already described. Unfortunately, cannibalism, like infanticide, does sometimes take place. But if it can be called a crime to eat the flesh of the dead, in order that death may not claim those who still live, then our race and every race has been guilty of that crime. Many expeditions of white men into the Arctic have come to know the same appalling needs which come to the Inuit, and not a few of these expeditions have saved lives at the expense of the dead. Yet, though we condemn other people as cannibals, we pity these men of our own race, and we think of their acts as the ultimate bravery of which man is capable. For to force one's self to eat of the dead demands a courage few of us have. A little bit of a tangent here. I mentioned that famous black and white silent film documentary, Nanook of the North, and thinking of racism and cultural judgment here. And I didn't bring up at the time, though it was somewhat relevant, my film professor, Frank Manchel, asking us if we'd noticed the racism in a scene that we just seen or in the movie. I can't remember if it was after the scene or the movie that he asked us. And I don't think anybody in the class was able to identify it. And he eventually pointed out that it was the showing of the Nanook's wife without a shirt, with her bare breasts, and how in the 19 teens, no white woman would ever have been shown on film without a shirt like that. And it was a sign of the lesser value placed on a woman who was not white. I have spoken to an old woman who now lives near the coast and who in her youth survived a terrible winter by eating the flesh of her parents after they had died of starvation. The marks of that experience still lie in her through the event, though the event is now 3 decades in the past. She is an object of sympathy to her people and is cared for and helped by all manner of men who have heard her grim tale. As for the woman, she never recovered from the mental ordeal she had faced. Though she lived on in the body, in her heart, death had lived for full 30 years. I find myself thinking about how much the people consider themselves to be almost of one and the same race and tribe as the caribou, and how they're perfectly happy to kill and eat the caribou. But no matter how much you consider the caribou to be of yourself, there's no question that eating of your tribesmen and your parents would be far, far worse and more traumatic. Cannibalism does happen, though rarely. The wonder is that it does not happen more frequently, and that murder and cannibalism do not happen together. There is no doubt at all but that the eating of the flesh of the dead is as abhorrent a thought to the Hamlet as it is to us. The difference is that the macabre decision must sometimes be met by the Hamlet, while we are spared. Now I have mentioned many of the crimes of which the Inuit race, as a race, are accused by those who seek an excuse for interfering with the ways of the people. Oh, desperate for a reason to interfere again. Narcissism is amazing. The Helmet, who must share this condemnation, are only men, after all, and not infallible. Therefore, there are deviations from law, and there are crimes in the land, for no race of men can be free of these things. But there are also certain forces which the people control, and which in turn direct the actions of men, and these forces keep the law breaking within narrow bounds. To understand these forces is to realize why the Ihama would have no need of our laws to maintain the security of their way of life. There is absolutely no internal organization to hold authority over the people. No one man or body of men holds power in any other sense than the magical. There is no council of elders, no policemen. There are no assemblies of government, and in the strictest sense, the Hamlet may be said to live in an anarchistic state, for they do not even have an inflexible code of laws. Makes me think of one of Daniel Quinn's books where he talks about tribal peoples as not having laws that you, traditional sense, that you, laws against people doing things that you know they're going to do. Their laws are designed to help the community become healthy and whole again when they do things that you know people are going to do. Much more sensible. Pause again here because I'm close to that 15-minute break. Yet the people exist in amity together, and the secret of this is the secret of cooperative endeavor, limited only by the power of human will and endurance. It is not blind obedience or obedience dictated by fear. Rather, it is intelligent obedience to a simple code that makes sense to those who must live by its rules. Now and again, a man may willfully step over the borders of the unwritten law. Perhaps he may refuse to share his deer kill with a less fortunate neighbor. Let us look at the result. Does the starving man revenge himself by killing the one who refused him and then take what he needs from the man he has killed? As that starving man considered doing to the white trader in that hard tale from chapters ago. Of course, he did not do it, even in his starving desperation. He preferred to risk death, walking with all of his starving tribesmen and tribeswomen back miles and miles through the snow. How many of us white civilized people would have caved and committed murder? Even just to protect ourselves, never mind the other people that we were traveling with. Does the starving man revenge himself by killing the one who refused him and then take what he needs from the man he has killed? No, not at all. He goes elsewhere for help, and never by word or deed does he show any overt resentment or anger toward the man who turned a deaf ear to his plea. This is so because there are certain things the barons do not allow to coexist with men, and foremost among these is anger. I could go on and on about the fascinating relationship of myself to anger and family members and my father and random bursts of anger and how I understand its value in the flow of emotions, but I have also come to see it as threatening and toxic, and as a result come to feel that suppressed anger in my life, suppressed so deeply I can't even tell that I'm angry, is possibly one of the real core challenges of my existence that could result in possibly even my early death if it's not resolved. Anger is in the heart of a man of the Hamlet is as potentially dangerous as homicidal madness, for an anger can make him overleap the law and endanger not only himself, but the rest of his community. It can lead him to ignore the perils which beset him and so bring him to destruction. Anger is a luxury in which the people dare not indulge, and apart from these physical reasons for its absence, the Hamlet have always looked upon anger as a sign of savagery, of immaturity, or of inhuman nature. Children alone are permitted brief outbursts of temper, for a child is not held responsible for his actions. But when a man gives way to anger, it is something of the deepest shame to the beholders, for anger is the only really indecent thing in the land. And so it is that a man who breaks the law is never punished in anger. The man who refused meat to his fellow may visit the camp of the aggrieved one if he wishes, and he will be well received. The resentment felt against him will not be allowed to appear naked and so provoke an outburst of physical violence. However, methods of punishment do exist. Should a man continuously disregard the law of life, then little by little he finds himself isolated and shut off from the community. There can be no more powerful punishment in the lonely wastes of the barrens. And in fact, it is a punishment which can easily be fatal in a world where man must work closely with man in order to live. A small dose of ostracism usually brings the culprit to an acute awareness of his defects, and he ceases to transgress the law. Thus, while there is no overt act of justice or of social revenge, nevertheless the object is achieved, and the wrongdoer almost invariably returns into the community once again, with no permanent stigma attached to his name. The law does not call for an eye for an eye. If possible, the breaker of the law is brought back to become an asset to the camps. His defection is tacitly forgotten, and to all intents and purposes, it never happened at all. That's amazing. One of my favorite movies of all time is Paul Thomas Anderson's Magnolia, and the overarching theme in civilized Los Angeles, as to be quoted, is forgiveness. The hardest thing what can we forgive? It's the hard thing about getting up every day, the hard thing about walking down the street. What can we forgive? Not just others, but in ourselves. To see such a description of a culture of deep ability to forgive is really beautiful. And of course, also the line that I quote most from that movie: we may be through with the past, but the past is not through with us. Forgiveness, as just described, is being through with the past in healthy ways. But the starvation and fear of death in those hard winters, when with the fear of death for your family and your children, that past, you're not through with that past. That past is not through with you, and it seems to come through in gratitude and love. Such is the punishment for the most major offenses. Minor offenses are dealt with by employing the powerful weapons of ridicule, and the Helmut are masters of that art. A man capable of doing his own hunting, but whose family must be fed by other hunters, because he is lazy or simply indifferent, is made the subject of the drum dance song and an object of biting laughter. Only a very callous man can face that sharp laugh for long. However, he knows that when he returns to his duties, the songs about him will disappear, and in time all memory of the incident will be washed from the minds of the people by common consent. On the other hand, if a man is prevented from doing his work because he has been crippled, or because he is one of those natural incompetents who botches whatever he puts his hand to, then the law makes an exception. In our society, such unfortunates may become embittered, or may even grow dangerous as a result of the treatment meted out to them. In the Hamlet camps, those who are physically or mentally unable to cope with the problems of living are treated with inexhaustible patience and understanding. Like in the human services jobs that I've worked, it's kind of a forced understanding a lot of the time because it's not true community, but the intent is there. Poor, dull-witted Oniqua, for instance, never managed to succeed in a single deer hunt during all the time I knew him. He tried hard enough, but it was always someone else who had to keep Oniqua's family from starving. And yet, as far as I know, no one ever seriously rebuked Oniqua for being a burden to his people. True, everyone made fun of his efforts to be a great hunter, but this was good-natured fun, and Oniqua joined in it himself. He even seemed to extract some sort of compensation from being able to provide a source of amusement from the other men. He was the butt of innumerable good-humored jests, but he was never exposed to the bitter ridicule which is the punishment of those who are capable of obeying the law, but who refuse. And here's an illustration, the illustration that I pasted to the thumbnail, to the background picture here, and it should be just above my shoulder, and it's probably Oniqua. The only physical punishment in the barrens is death, but the death penalty is not the same as with us. It is not intended as an act of social revenge or even as a warning to other potential wrongdoers. It exists only as a means of releasing a man who cannot live in the land he has defied, or as a means of releasing the people from an added danger to their lives. When a man becomes mad, and only a madman kills, according to the beliefs of the people, and murders or threatens to murder those who live about him, then and then only the sentence of death is invoked. There is no trial, no official passing of judgment. Perhaps 3 or 4 men, usually those most closely related to or most closely concerned with the murderer, meet and speak indirectly of the problem which faces the entire community. One of the number is usually designated as the executioner. But he is not an instrument of justice as we know it, for his task is not to punish, but to release the soul of the madman from the physical life, which can only end in agony of the flesh if it is prolonged. The executioner does his duty quickly and humanely, for the idea of physical or mental torture is simply not known to the Ahelmwit. When the deed is done, the executioner obeys the spirit laws and begs forgiveness from the ghost of the dead man. If he is lucky and the white men do not hear of it, that is the end of the matter. But in not a few cases, Eskimos who have had the terrible task of destroying brothers, fathers, or sons so that the rest may survive have been brought to the bar of white man's justice and rewarded for the mental sufferings that they have endured by being hanged by the neck until they were dead.